Romantic love and sentimental marriage in antebellum America. So, what we're going to be looking at here is the development of this ideal of romantic love and sentimental marriage, marriage based on love, that becomes very popular in the early 19th century. And the focus on romance, a lot of where that comes from is a new kind of publication, which are novels, specifically novels that are written from a female point of view, focusing in on women's choices, women's reactions, their emotions that drive the narrative of these novels. And some of them have happy endings. The woman ends up married, which is always the happy ending. But some of them, it's a tragedy. She ends up dying in childbirth of a bastard child, or something like that. The heroines in these novels are almost always middle-class heroines who are notable because they're shown as being moral, they're shown as having concern for others, and having a sort of unique emotional sensitivity that makes her admirable. And this is in a time period where the middle class is just emerging as a new class. And it's sort of contrasting the middle class heroine with her morality and her emotional gifts to the decadent aristocracy of the old elite. So the concept of romantic love and its relationship to marriage in this era is important. And it's a time period where you're supposed to fall in love before marriage. Not that everybody does it in practice, but that's what marriage is supposed to be about. And in fact, when they have lawsuits for breach of promise, in other words, you sue a man because he asked you to marry him and then he broke his promise and married someone else, you can have your father do a lawsuit against him. And in the past, that would just be about money for the injury to reputation and your opportunities. But now, with the new focus on romantic love, you also can charge for your emotional damage, the hurt to your feelings, your broken heart. So it's a changing set of ideas. The idea is that you're supposed to fall in love with the inner nature of the person, not their outward trappings, not what they look like as much as their soul. The goal was to marry for love, not money or social standing. But if we look back at those novels, which are sort of the model for this, in those stories, the good husband-to-be or the good love object of these stories always is financially secure. The idea is you don't marry for social trappings, you don't marry for money, but somehow it's always supposed to end up in a financially secure position anyways. And the goal is to create a union of souls. And during courtship, whereas before, in the colonial period, you might have bundling where the courting couple is rolled up in blankets and allowed to sleep next to each other to sort of do their courtship. In this time, it's a matter of sitting in the parlor and talking and sharing secrets and building this connection, emotional and connection of love. But it is always supposed to be a shared morality, a shared love, but not the kind of wicked animal passions that might drive you to do sinful things. As one historian, Nancy Cott, has explained, reason, virtue, and moderation were what you were looking for, not fortune, beauty, or momentary passion. Now, unlike the patriarchal household we emphasized before, they think of this marriage now as more of a partnership, that both sides, both the husband and the wife, have reciprocal rights and responsibilities that they have to carry through in their marriage. However, the men and women are fundamentally different in this viewpoint. And whereas a man has the rationality, the legal right, the authority to govern. The wife, on the other hand, as a woman, is naturally submissive, naturally much more passive. And so it's a partnership, and it's described as an equal partnership, but it's a partnership in which one side is the side in control. The husband has the right to command. The wife has the right to try to persuade her husband what is the right thing to do. And it's thought of as a contract. And it's a contract that if either side fails to live up to their obligations, so you commit adultery, fail to support your wife, all these different violations, there's the possibility of divorce, a break of that contract. And in fact, divorce has become easier and more common in this period. And it still falls under the concept of coverture, in which the idea is that when a woman marries, she legally becomes part of her husband. So that's why wives can't vote. Well, women in general can't vote. Women are represented by their husbands. Same thing in terms of if a woman owns property upon marriage, that becomes her husband's property. If she earns wages, those are her husband's wages. If she wants to try to file for divorce, she's got to do it where her husband is located, because that is also her legal residence. And just to get a sense of the difference between the two genders, women are supposed to be submissive, devout. They're much more connected to God. And in this time period, women are much more likely to go to church than men. And church membership becomes increasingly female. Women are naturally moral. They have moral principles that are inborn into them in a way that men just don't. Women are passionless. If you remember, in the colonial era, women are much more passionate. They have much stronger libidos. They're much more driven by sex. Well, it's the opposite in the antebellum period. Those strong sexual passions have disappeared. A good woman is without them. And a woman is domestic, devoted to her home and nurturing to the loved ones in her family. Men, on the other hand, men are aggressive. Men are dominant. They're competitive. They're passionate. They have all the sexual passion that women have lost. And so they have a fundamentally different nature than women. And in fact, historians describe this as separate spheres. The idea that in some ways, men and women simply live in separate worlds. That there's the world of work and politics that takes place in the city, the place where men compete and work and engage in disputes and all the rest of it. That's the man's world. And then there's the woman's domain, the woman's world, which is at home, the domestic scene. And that's a place of love and nurturing where men go back to for refreshment at the end of the day. And this sort of idea of separate spheres is encouraged by the fact that in this time period, the middle class is beginning to move their houses out to the suburbs. And so you have this idea of the city is the men's domain in a lot of ways, whereas the suburbs are the women's. Passionate friendships. Going along with this idea that men and women are so different, it's accepted that men and women are probably going to have very strong friendships with people of their same sex, who are like them, who understand the same kinds of things. And those friendships are expected to start particularly in youth, but often they're seen as maybe extending lifelong in cases. We look at these friendships, and they don't neatly fit into our categories of friend versus spouse versus love object. They're a little bit more ambiguous than that by our standards. And this ambiguity allows some people with queer relationships to pass unnoticed. First of all, these relationships were usually not seen as a conflict with a marriage. A wife might write to her good friend, "Oh, I long for your visit. We will snuggle in bed together and share the same pillow and throw my husband out to sleep on the couch." And all of that would be seen as perfectly reasonable, a sign of their good friendship. People who will discuss a great deal of intimacy with their same-sex friend will not see that as something that's going to interfere with their ability to marry. These relationships could have a lot of emotional and physical intimacy. And that emotional and physical intimacy could be cuddling, it could be kissing, it could be something further than that we might see as sexual, basically. So, in a time period where sodomy was a crime, that's male penetrative sex with another man, is the way they're thinking about it at this point in time. There's no laws against female sexuality with other females because they didn't really think of it as, well, they didn't really think of it as that possible, right? Because how can you have sex without a penis? And we have descriptions like this when we look at letters. One man, Thomas Jefferson Withers, wrote to his former bedmate, a man who he had shared a bed with for some years or for some time, James Hammond, in 1826, and he writes, "I am writing to learn whether you sleep in your shirt tail yet, and whether you have the extravagant delight of poking and punching a writhing bedfellow with your long fleshen pole, the exquisite touches of which I have often had the honor of feeling." Okay, that to us reads pretty sexual. But at the same time, in the same letters that they say things like this, and there are other comments, similar comments, they talk about their chances of getting married. So they don't see a contradiction. Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus were two young black women in the late 1850s, 1860s who had a strong, well, romantic devotion is how we would think of it. They wrote intense letters to each other. Addie writes in one letter in 1861, "I dreamt of you last night. I thought I was sitting on your lap with my head on your bosom and other things that were connected with it. I will not tell you at present. When I wake up in the night and found it was all a dream, I was so disappointed." So you have this intense romantic seeming relationship. And that relationship didn't end when Rebecca got married. It only ended when Rebecca died young at 28. And so you're left with this reality that bed sharing was a very common thing. There were not an unlimited number of beds, so it was very common if you're visiting or something like that, you share a bed with someone else. Sharing a bed did not necessarily lead to sex. Not all sex was romantic. But on the other hand, there were some elements that in some cases could be erotic. And then finally, you do have cases that really do fill our category for clearly a erotic romantic relationship. Just to give one example, Sylvia Drake and Charity Bryant in 1807 began living together, and they actually built a one-room home in Vermont, opened up a tailoring business, and lived together for more than 44 years, sharing a bed, living in the community. Bryant acted as a husband in terms of doing the more masculine chores and presenting herself as sort of the more head of the household to the community, whereas Drake performed the wife's domestic chores. And they lived in this small town in Vermont and were generally accepted by the community. They never had a formal marriage ceremony, of course. They definitely weren't seen as an ordinary couple, but they were willing to put up with it. They ran a good business. They contributed to the community and the church. And they were accepted to some extent in the community. As well as cases where they'll write in the newspaper about discovering that an ordinary married couple had one of the spouses has died, and then they discover at that point that the husband had initially been born as female but had been living as a man for all these years. So we know that something more was possible and did happen sometimes. So the conclusions of this, there's a lot of things I packed into this lecture. First of all, there's the rise of romantic love as expressed in the novel and as the way that women and men take it as a model in their own lives and in their ideas of courtship and marriage. Marriage as a contract, something that both sides have duties in, both sides need to uphold, and yet it may be an equal partnership, but it's a partnership in which the husband is firmly in command. The ongoing concept of coverture, which is much older than this, but was still in existence. The idea that men and women are so fundamentally different in a lot of ways they live in separate spheres, separate worlds. And finally, the existence of strong homosocial bonds, strong bonds between men and women that have an impact in their lives in ways that can vary from the common intense friendships to the much more uncommon actual romantic relationships. And sources that this drew on: Ruth Block, Stephanie Kuntz, Nancy Cott, and Rebecca Davis.